Okay, well, hi there. Welcome to Intersections, the podcast and YouTube series where we discuss the intersection of Christ and culture. From movies to politics, we discuss how culture and Christianity relate to one another from a Wesleyan perspective. And I'm your host, Brandon Hughes. And with me today is Braden Parks.
What?
So if you want to introduce yourself, Reverend Parks, you can go ahead and do
Yeah,
that.
I'm Reverend Braden Taylor Parks. I serve here in the IGRC in Central Illinois. And Brandon and I have been friends for at least the last 3 years, if not longer. I don't know how long it's been, but I think it's been at least 3 years, if not longer, 3 to 5 plus years since our days at Asbury Theological Seminary. So
Yeah.
there you go.
Yeah, thanks for joining me today, Brady. Brady and I were classmates and we're housemates as well for
Yeah.
a couple of years, and we became good friends. And we are on opposite political sides, I would say, pretty drastically, but we still love each other. And so, for Brady's audience, if you plan on sharing this with your congregation or anything, I'm Brandon Hughes. I'm a pastor here in the West Ohio Annual Conference in Southern Ohio. I have a couple churches in the Hocking Hills area. If any of you know where that is, probably not, but it's kind of the landmark around here. So with that, we'll just go ahead and get started and just kind of open up what we're going to be doing here. And so the premise here is we're actually going through kind of chapter by chapter this book, How Would Jesus Vote, by Darrel Bock.
There you go.
Darrel Bock's in the middle there.
Good.
And basically, this is our guide to our discussion, but we're not going through like paragraph by paragraph of this book by any means. But basically, we're discussing the intersection of God and government and the heart of politics, basically as ideas rather than politicians. And so we're not going to be discussing our disagreements about politicians, because I don't think any of us would fall in love with any of these politicians. I think each of us have a couple that we really like, and then otherwise we're like, take it or leave it. And so we want to talk more about the ideas that's underlying the policy decisions rather than the people who execute those ideas. And so we'll be discussing one of those viewpoints, but we'll be discussing the opposite viewpoint of ours. And the reason I wanted to do it this way is to avoid a debate, so to say, and so we can foster an understanding of one another and just come at it, again, from a Christian perspective, why the certain sides view things the way they do.
Yeah.
And then we'll have clarifying questions. And rather than me as a conservative trying to debate Brady's liberal idea, I'll be helping to correct his understanding of the conservative idea. And so it'll be a lot more constructive for understanding one another and a lot less divisive. Yeah. And then after discussing each side, we'll discuss a little bit about the book's middle ground, because it sometimes tries to find a middle ground, and some points of humility where we may better reflect Christ ultimately. So the topics today are the first few chapters of the book, which are starting points, loving our neighbor and the role of government. And then we'll go into the size of government, whether big or small government is the ideal. And then economics and poverty, whether personal wealth or shared resources is the ideal starting point.
Yep.
And so as we begin, the whole starting point is loving our neighbors. And in this book, it talks about the three common ideas and core beliefs of what government should do and what we should do is stewardship, love, and accountability. With stewardship, it points to Genesis 1, where God commands us to be rulers over the world. With love, obviously the greatest commandment, to love God with all our heart, mind, body, and soul, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. And then accountability, it gives a quote from Thomas Paine and also a quote from 1 Corinthians. So Thomas Paine said, "A people accountable to nobody ought not to be trusted by anybody." And then 1 Corinthians 10, 23 to 24, everything is permitted, but not everything is beneficial. Everything is permitted, but not everything edifies. Do not seek your own good, but the good of the other. And so it seems like this book is kind of working those three ideas in tandem, the stewardship, love, and accountability, in a way to kind of for each of us to humbly seek a sort of middle ground and a humility breaking point in a way. Yeah. And so where we'll begin is where does government come into play with these 3 points. And so if we could, we'll just go ahead and describe the role of government broadly from the opposite side's perspective. And so I'll actually go ahead and start from the progressive side, progressive perspective. Again, we'll be discussing the opposite sides. And so the way I see the goal of the government in the United States from the progressive perspective is to uphold justice and the general welfare of the populace, to prevent oppression and injustice, to institute fair and level economic environments, to provide essential services at the community level, and to provide necessary care for the poor. Now, that's kind of a quick and dirty list, but is there anything, you think that's a pretty good summary of what government should be doing?
Yeah, I would just say it's a lot more hands-on, and we'll get that in different chapters, but it's a lot more hands-on.
Okay.
So, and then, is it my turn to talk, or is you still going?
So a lot more hands-on. So what do you mean by a lot more hands-on then?
Well, I mean, going to a size of government, the progressive side is more hands-on by saying more government action in all things practically. Whether that's big issues or small issues, whether that's and the progressives, liberals, or liberal side, I would say Democrats, want a higher centralized government versus local government as well. I think that's what I mean by hands-on. I don't want to say it's micromanaging, because I don't think that's it, but I just think the left side believes that the centralized government knows what it will do, knows what it's doing, and doesn't at times trust the individuals to be kind to the poor and to kind to other things and other people, like the environment and individuals, especially in poverty. I think Democrats feel that it's not being taken care of, and so that the centralized government should step in and do that. I think that's what I mean by hands-on, that they step in and try to come up with solutions. And not that they don't like local government, but I think they think, as the liberal side, is that the centralized government can get more done and be more efficient than local governments and individuals can. And I really think that's what I mean by more hands-on.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. So now can you kind of answer that same question from the conservative perspective? The role of government.
And I grew up in Texas, so that's my background. And things that I remember the most growing up conservatively in Texas is defending the Constitution. I think the number one thing that the conservatives feel that the government is for is defending the rights and the freedoms of the individual, as stated by the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, and the governing laws and regulations of our nation. And so I believe, trying to come from a conservative aspect again, that the main point of government from a conservative Republican side is to defend the country and abide by the Constitution as strictly, as black and white, and as strictly as we can. Of course, being first the Bill of Rights. And so I think that's, I'm ironically a lot less trying to nail down the major thesis point of the entire party. And I think that's it. I think it's defense of the nation and trying to follow the Constitution and legislate the Constitution as fairly and as critically as possible. Is that what you would think?
Yeah, that's pretty good. So yeah, it's a lot about individual freedom and protecting the individual person's ability to act as they would. And so there's a lot of that going back to the Declaration of Independence too. That we're all created in God's image, and we all have inalienable rights. And so we don't see the Constitution as the root of those things. Yeah, they're just kind of spelled out in that. Yeah, and so they see we would see all those roots as God given, but the Constitution is the legal document that protects them. And so you pretty much summed it up pretty well. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's really good.
Yeah, it's as I said, I did come from a conservative background, so I do know in some ways that as well. So I'm trying to be fair to my upbringing as well. So
Right. Yeah, and that's one reason I thought you'd be great for this, honestly,
yeah,
because you did grow up in Texas in a conservative background, and you
yeah,
kind of shifted gears. And so,
yeah,
you kind of mentioned that the stuff for big or small government when you were clarifying what I said, that
yeah.
kind of snuck into this chapter, and that's what I've noticed. These first few chapters are very kind of loose as to how they're
Totally.
structured, where a lot of the topics and ideas kind of lead
Yeah,
into the other
of
chapters.
course.
And so, was there anything in the first chapter or the first couple chapters that you
I'm
wanted
looking
to?
through my highlighted notes. I'm not being rude. I have it on my cell phone, so just
Okay.
for everyone's notice. So I am looking through all my highlighted notes. I think the introduction's pretty straightforward. Trying to find
Yeah, it talks a lot about the founding of the.
founding fathers and all
Yeah.
that. I really like this quote, and I highlighted it, and it says, and it's under the first paragraph of Reason and Humble Faith. In chapter 1, it says, they, the founding fathers and mothers, because I know they're females as well that helped found our nation, but they preserved public space for each other and called that space religious liberty as part of the representative government with shared powers and checks and balances. I think that's really important to understand this entire discussion. And I think this is why Brandon asked me, now that we're in an election year and the election's happening on November 3rd, 2020, in a couple of weeks, but our founding fathers and mothers really built spaces, intentional spaces where people could fairly share their opinions. And yes, not everyone was educated to the level of knowing, being literate. And so a lot of people weren't literate, but the people that had literacy, and not just literacy, but had political understanding, and all people, and they didn't want to discriminate to those who didn't know how to read, but anyone who had an opinion on politics could share that with, hopefully without being blasphemed, without being hung or anything like this. And I think that's what's beautiful of our nation, whether you like it or not, at times, that our nation was, our founding fathers and mothers intentionally built spaces where we could communicate. And I've always felt recently that there's not really that anymore. I think we don't really have safe spaces to discuss
Right.
fairly the topics. And that's
Right.
why I said yes to this. I said yes to Brandon's asking me to be a part of this, because this might be the safest place to do that. And how Brandon has, I think, fairly formatted this discussion in this, using this book by Mr. Brock, or Bock, Brock, yeah. But I think that's really where I'm coming from this, and why I said yes to this is because Brandon has, in my understanding, created an intentional space where we can share ideals and not politically or shame each other in our characters,
Right.
whether on social media or in person.
Right.
So
Yeah, that's entirely the reason for all this, because
yeah,
just as you said, there's not really a place where people can be open and have like a cordial discussion with one another. Everything is driven on these like punchlines and these like phrases that
yeah,
have a lot of depth, but no one wants
yep.
to discuss the depth. They just want to throw accusations at one another.
Yeah.
And so
And
that's
character
that's
shaming, yeah, and there's a lot of character shaming, which is sad, and that's why Brandon and Brandon is one of my dear friends, and we joke about each other's political alignments, but we love each other at the end of the day. And this is, as I said, this might be the new intentional space for political discussion, and that being positive, not negative, not character shaming or anything like that.
Right.
So I think that's one of the big statements that I saw in the first chapter that I really appreciated that our founding fathers did.
Yeah, and that's something we both sides can agree to that. That's a problem that this culture has now, that we need to get back to the the reason that our country is this
Yeah.
way, so that we
Yeah.
can have open discussion peacefully
Yeah.
and cordially. And when it comes to serious issues, we can
Yeah.
be honest and open and not have to worry about, you know, all these, again, the character shaming and the very personal attacks that seem to happen all the time. And so as we go into the next chapter, so we kind of sum together the first two chapters into one little quick segment. And that's because it is very straightforward. If any of you are watching this, you probably know and have an understanding of the founding of our nation a little bit, and kind of agree to all those principles. And that's kind of what the book was starting out as, to make sure that everyone had the same starting points. And I think, again, if anyone's watching this or listening to this, you probably agree with that starting point. And so as we go into chapter 3, the size of government, the discussion about big or small government, as it gets into this chapter, it actually starts talking about a separation, the separation of church and state, where there's two separate entities, and how this nation was created so that the church could be preserved separate from the state, and the state would not be, I don't know, too influenced by the church. And that's coming from, in England, there was a parliamentary house that was made up of bishops of the church. And the queen or king was the head of the Church of England, but also the head of state. And so as a parliamentary theocracy.
Yeah.
And so that was what this nation came from. And so we saw a very important need to separate the two for the protection of the two. And so that also for a protection of non-Christians who would want to reside, or even, really then even non-Anglicans, there were other Protestants and even Catholics who were very, very much persecuted in England. And so they didn't want that kind of environment in the US.
Well,
and so,
go for it.
Okay, you can go ahead.
Well, not only that, you had people like Bloody Mary, who was a Catholic killing Protestants, and other Protestant leaders in the past, killing Catholics and drowning Anabaptist people. This is the history of European Middle Age Christianity when it was controlled by who was ever in power. If the Protestants were in power or the Catholics were in power, then they literally killed each other over their theological differences. And so I think that's another, and like the French Huguenots were some of the first people from Europe to come to America for that reason of, religious freedoms as our nation was established, and the French Revolution and everything like that in France, not just in England, but a few years later at the beginning of the 1800s, the late 1700s, early going into the 1800s. And so I think that was another thing as well, is that, you had persecuted people religiously or non-religiously from theological differences. And I think the founding mothers and fathers wanted to accept everyone from every denomination, and not just, and other faith traditions as well. You brought up Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine was an atheist. So we had atheists and deists who helped were a part of the founding fathers and mothers, just as much as we had Christians, Protestant and Catholics, who helped found this nation. So we had a diverse group of people. So.
Right. And so when you start talking about the separation of the church and the state from the perspective of European imperialism, where church and state was together, the book kind of questions us to, we talked about what the government's role is, but the book kind of urges us to question what the government should be. And so not the role of it or what it should do, but it's asking what the government should be. Yeah. And so, Brady, I'd like you to start off this segment. What is the conservative's perspective of what the government should and should not be?
I'm looking through the quotes right now, but I'm also thinking about my past. And I've actually never been in I've always been in Christian culture, a conservative Christian culture. So I'm just thinking of that too with everything. In my opinion, understanding the conservative background with what government should be, it should be more local. Like I said in the beginning, it should be more localized, because the Conservative Party sees the local and state governments as knowing the issues better than the centralized government. Once again, government is for the defending the Declaration of Independence, the rights of the individual. Excuse me, Sunday is killing my voice and still recovering from Sunday. But my biggest thing that I've seen is that government, essentially the centralized government, should stay out of individual lives, other than defending those individual rights, other than protecting the rights of the individual, other than defending the individual when necessary, whether in war or natural disasters like we've been having. I grew up in Rita Katrina. I remember the centralized and state governments working together to help New Orleans, help Houston area, help East Texas. But I really think that the government, on the conservative side view, is the smaller the government, the better, so that the individual can have more power. And if we have to give power to a government, it's more our localized government and our state governments, because being from Texas, the people in Austin would know better the issues of the state of Texas and the city of Austin and the surroundings than people in DC. And that's what I have grew up believing, and what I grew up hearing from my family, parents, and other friends and other family members, is the people who are in our localized governments, Houston and state government in Texas, know better than the centralized government in DC how to help us in our day-to-day, especially with things like lowering taxes is a big issue in the Conservative Party, and defending our rights, especially as seen in the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and the following amendments of the Constitution. And I'm trying to put it all together so I'm not just rambling.
Right. Yeah.
So
what do you think the conservatives would say government should not be then?
Government, this correlates to how you started as well. Government should not have when we say government, I mean the centralized government.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't think the conservatives have a problem with government. I just think the level of government is where they draw the line. Because there's a lot of people in the conservative side who love the localized government, I shouldn't say love, who like more, love is a strong word, but like more the localized government, because they know the people who are in their government. They trust the local, because they voted them there. Yes, they voted in DC, don't get me wrong, but they personally know the people on the city councils and the township councils. I grew up in a township, so we had a township council made up of people that I've known practically my whole life, or I've heard about my whole life. So essentially, the conservative side, we can trust them because we personally have a relationship with them outside of politics, and they know the issues. Like, I grew up in the Woodlands, and so they know the issues of the Woodlands better than people in DC, even at times better than those in Austin, Texas, 3-4 hours away. And so what the conservative side, in my opinion, would say is no to more centralized government, because they don't know really the issues. Then they'll raise our taxes and taking it more for themselves, and limiting the rights of the individuals and limiting the power of the local and state government. And I think that's really where the conservatives lie, is that the government more power should not be given to the centralized government, because it will limit the rights. They believe it will limit the rights of the individual and the local government and state government, and they should not have their hands. I also believe that on the conservative side, I think they see the centralized government as micromanaging a lot of things, micromanaging things like healthcare, micromanaging how we see gun rights, micromanaging how we see taxes, what we should be, if we should increase taxes or decrease taxes or keep taxes as the way they are, and how you should use taxes, and things like as I already said, healthcare and things. Those are the big issues. Healthcare, taxes, guns, things like that. And so I believe that the conservatives would see the more power we give to the centralized powers that be in DC, the more they micromanage and take away our freedoms and rights. And so that's what I would say the conservative side would not want to see the government, big C government, meaning centralized government, giving them more power.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
is that fair? Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. I think one thing that this book is trying to also drill home is, again, this separation of church and state thing is actually a very big thing for conservatives. And I think a big fear for conservatives is this idea that people are treating the government like they would the church. They're seeing the government as fulfilling the role of the church in some way, especially the way it treats those who are impoverished and in need. And I think that's something that it's kind of a nuanced thing that conservatives believe, but I think it's a real thing that a lot of conservatives do kind of not want the government to be. They don't want the government to come in and replace a lot of the things the church does for various reasons, which we'll get into kind of next. But yeah, that's one thing. And then it quoted a verse in this chapter, or a few verses, Romans 13, 1-7. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there's no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. And that's actually a key part, I think, of what conservatives believe, is that the government is not to be worried so much about good conduct as it is bad. And so it sees sometimes if the government starts encroaching on good conduct, then it will be a detriment to society. And that's kind of a nuanced thing, but I think it's actually a big point of what conservatisms worry about. So does that sound, you think that sounds pretty fair?
I mean, and I'll say this though, it's interesting more recently, I grew up with the Bushes. I remember the Bush election was, George W., I should say, not Papa Bush, who just passed away, RIP. But Bush Jr., as I like to call him. It's interesting, I think somewhere the Conservative Party took the idea of Christianity though too. So people in the Conservative Party run under the Christian identity as well. And I think that's just a very interesting detail to all that what you said, that they don't want to give more power to the centralized government because they want the church to fill that role. Mm-hmm. But then what if you have a person who is a Christian or claims to be a Christian and doing the will of God from the centralized government, from DC? And then it gets a little murky,
Yeah.
And then I think I think in some ways with, the Conservative Party, since I've been alive the last 30 years, I've seen that. So for good or for bad. So.
Okay. So I'm going to touch kind of quickly on the progressive perspective of what the government should be. And so I talked earlier about what it should do. It should be protecting those who are oppressed. It should be providing a level playing field in the economy. But really, those are kind of outdrawings of being a safety net for those who are struggling. And so that's one thing the government should be. It should be protecting people from being oppressed by others, from being oppressed by the system. It should be a protector of human rights, and in a broad way, protector of groups who are, generally oppressed. And what it should not be is a force of oppression. And so it used a couple verses here. Amos 4:1, hear this word, you cows of Bashan, who are on Mount Samaria, who oppress the poor, who crush the needy, who say to their husbands, bring something to drink. The Lord God has sworn by his holiness, the time is surely coming upon you when they shall take you away with hooks, even the last of you with fish hooks. And that's kind of describing, what the government should avoid being. And it should not be an oppressive force of the poor. It should not be siding with certain groups. And another part is Proverbs 22:22, do not rob the poor because they are poor, or crush the afflicted at the gate. And so the government should not be serving its own special interests. The people that get into government should not be perpetrators of their own interests, but they should be trying to serve the greater good. And so, and kind of in short, progressive wants the government to be a protector, a safety net, and an institution of justice, real justice, instead of just justice for who they see fit. They should be avoiding oppressive systems and avoiding the taking advantage of the poor.
Yeah.
Does that pretty much cover a lot of the bases?
Yeah, it does. And the one I'll hit up on the biggest thing, and I'll add this, that what you said implies this, but I don't think you said it if I didn't hear it correctly. But equality for all people, and we've already talked about this in the intro. But I think, like you said, not siding with special interest. And I think that's an issue. I think both sides, of course, have special interest groups. Don't get me wrong. I mean, they're always having to listen to everybody, trying to cater to them, getting their special interest ideals out there. But equality for all people, I think that's really what it comes down to for the liberal party, is equality, 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 and unity, equality, unity, and I always go back to this verse, and I don't remember if he talked about it, but I would say this is the blanket verse that, seen in context, is really important. It's Micah 6:8. It says, "Oh man, oh person, man, female, what does the Lord require of you? But to seek justice, to seek justice, to love mercy, and walk humbly with your God." So this is that first thing. It's not arbitrary. That justice comes first, actually. Seeking justice is what the minor prophets, that God told the minor prophets to tell Israel. That was the message. You're not seeking justice. You're not being the priest of who I called you, the priest of all nations. And you're actually oppressing, like you said, oppressing the poor and the outsider and the sojourner. You're not letting them glean your fields. You're not giving them what I have told you to do in the law, in the Torah, in the law. And I think that's really where I come down on the progressive side. I would add this on the progressive side that you're trying to fairly describe. It's just the equality for all people, no matter color, race, sexual orientation, whatever, no matter what, we're made in the image of God, and that we shouldn't be trying to placate to special interest groups or special interest individuals, but as God has asked us to, through his word, to seek justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. And that's where I come down, but I think you did a great job. I would just add that unity and equality are so important. And Jesus prays that in the Garden of Gethsemane before he's about to be crucified, make them one as we are one. And I think that's a big point in the Democratic Party, is equality, equality, equality. And they always bring that up.
So I have a question about that. So you quoted where Jesus is talking about make them all one as we are one.
Yeah.
A lot of people would say that. I would as well. Is that talking about welcoming people into the church? No. And so again, I think this is why this idea of separating church and state is important. And you mentioned last time that conservatives kind of take over a role of church when they go in government. But see, I think this seems like it's an idea where progressives are taking the role of that
on the progressive side.
Yeah, so it's like the same kind of thing on the progressive side, and I think that's really interesting.
Yeah,
that you guys see unity and love and all of that as
equality.
And equality.
It's coming from Jesus, as coming from the Torah, as coming from the minor prophets. Yeah.
Okay. Alrighty then. So as we go on, do you remember on let's see, I have a page number, but that's not very useful to you, where it says "Big government or small? A look at the debate." This.
Yeah. What is that in chapter 3 still?
Yeah, it's in chapter 3.
Okay, I'm in chapter 3. I'm looking through my highlighted notes. I know where you're at, so let me just pull that up. Man, okay, here we go. Yep.
So this is the big points. It actually lists the big points of the conservative side, against the role, against the big government. And so can you kind of like summarize all those things? You know, you can even just go through and just talk about those points from a conservative perspective.
Oh, conservative perspective.
Yeah, start that.
Yeah, let me try. Oh, okay, that's just that. Okay. I'm trying to find that again. Sorry.
Oh, you're fine.
Big government is Oh, yeah.
So how do you?
Yeah, I'm looking at the paragraph now. So the list here, and I'll just read it and then I'll explain what they, what on a conservative side. It says, first point is big government is unaffordable. So of course, I mean, it's just not practical because we don't have the money and we're already trillions in debt. I mean, we're already in trillions of debt from the last 30 years since I've been alive. I'm just, I'm 30 years old, so I'm just thinking the last 30 years. So we're just already trillions in debt. It's just the more you get big government, centralized government, the more it's going to cost. So practically it's not going to work because it's too costly. Big government is incompatible with economic growth. So on the other side, the more the conservatives believe, or at least, this is what I'm saying that they believe, correct me if I'm wrong, that the more you get to the centralized government, take away from the local, state, and individual, you actually take away the ability and put more, regulations. The big government, centralized government, will regulate businesses more. That regulate, and it'll throw more regulations on small, especially mom and pop businesses, small businesses, local businesses, and let big business thrive and flourish because they can get away with more because they just have more, because they have more power because they have more stuff. And they have more connections in DC and all over the world. It says big government is incompatible with economic growth because there's more, they just add more regulations, more taxes, more regulations. Third point is big government does not work. That's just, that's a blatant, I don't know how to describe that.
I think you actually talked about it earlier when you talked about, how a centralized government doesn't really understand the issues of the community.
Of the local and the state and the individual. Yeah. Okay, yeah, we'll describe it that way. I think they are talking about other countries, maybe in that point, things like communism, socialism, which are more essentially centralized governments, where the individual has less and less freedoms and rights. I think that's what they're talking about there. Big government breeds corruption because once again, if you can monopolize things and then special interest groups, Amazon or, big company, I'm just thinking big companies, Walmart, they could just, because they have the connections and, healthcare and insurance companies, the big ones, Blue Cross Blue Shield, stuff like that. And so the bigger you get, the more monopolization you can get as well. You have, so it breeds corruption. And so you just, pay people off, go under the table, make those connections. And once again, it's less personal because as I said, when in local government, which the conservatives are more for, you actually know the person more likely than you do your state representative. And then lastly, it says big government limits freedoms. Once again, I think it's just the idea of regulations on amendments, regulations on the Declaration of Independence, regulations on the Bill of Rights, speech, firearms, assembly, things like this. And it seems that all we can do is vote. And in some ways, I think the conservative would see that all I can really do is vote because the big government, and maybe in their view, that the big government already monopolizes things like my freedoms. And so the more we become progressive or the more we become governmentally centralized, the less freedoms I have to do what those inalienable rights that you were talking about, seen in our Constitution, Declaration of Independence, and things like that. So I don't know if I missed some things,
that's good for all the solid points. So do you have an idea of what kind of a like a Christian understanding of all that? Is there like a guiding moral, do you think, behind all that thought? Can you imagine?
of the conservative side?
Yeah, on the
Oh,
conservative
okay. I'm like, that's a big question. I think ironically, I think this is the most ironic point in politics in general. I think both sides come down to the image of God. I really do. Most of them, especially when you get to corruption, limiting freedoms, the idea that big government doesn't work because once again it just puts more regulations on the individual, and I think the conservative would say it comes down to the image of God. I think it comes down which ironically that's what I come down to on the liberal side, Democratic side.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, it comes down, I think, to the same principle,
Yeah.
but it's how we see that principle at work that we deviate. I think that's so it's really interesting. And as I said, I think Micah 6:8 would totally, I don't think you would deny Micah 6:8.
Oh, of course not.
I mean, I hope not. I mean, and I think we have the same verses and the same scriptural context and the same, principles like morality, freedom, justice for all, equality, unity. But we just see them working out in different ways.
So I would say that for the conservative side, I'd say a big moral, taking that image of God thing and you touched a lot on the freedoms and stuff. Yeah. I think a big aspect of that is the idea that a big government would restrict freedom, but not just like what we're able to do, but just kind of restrict our ability to do good even. And so it's that overstepping of the church or of the state into the church that they're kind of fearful of because they don't want to do things that we think individuals should be doing.
And I think interestingly enough, from both sides, I think there's just a lot of fear. I just really think from both sides, whether conservative or liberal, I think we just try to let's fear the other side because they're either just, they see things differently. I think there's a lot of fear there that, our religious freedoms are going to go away. I mean, that's a big thing for the conservative side. I hear that a lot. Well, if we have a liberal person in power and more centralized government, our freedoms are going to go away, especially our religious freedom. And I think, I won't get on what I actually personally believe on that because I'm defending the conservative side, the one the worldview I had when I grew up. And as I was in college and thinking about and processing the last 10 years since leaving home. I think that's the biggest, there's a lot of fear that from the conservative side, right now I have the conservative hat on, my beautiful conservative hat. As a conservative, I feared that a centralized and more centralized, powerful government would take away my religious freedoms away.
Right.
And I think that's a big. I think that's a big fear, and I think that's a big issue. And that's with the talk of big government or small government, or what level of government we make bigger. I mean, because as a conservative, I want our local government to be bigger because they will give they know Braden Taylor Parks. My people will, they know me on a personal level, my family, my kids, that I'm a pastor, they know me personally. And so the more power we give to the local government, the more power we give back to the individual.
That pretty much sums it up pretty well then.
I think so.
So now me going to the progressive side, perspective. For me, trying to present the progressive side is this idea that, again, I really liked this idea of the church and state being separate. And so the progressive side would say, well, the church is failing to be the church for a lot who need them. The church is failing in a lot of ways to do what it should be doing in the world. And so the reason we have this separation of church and state is so that the state can kind of step in and help for the times when the church is failing. And so it is an expensive thing sometimes, and it's something that, causes a lot more people to kind of chip in. But ultimately, it's because the church is not big enough anymore to do the things that it used to be able to do. And then this whole idea of the financial cost of everything and how big it gets, that's kind of looking at it from an incorrect angle because even though there's a big cost to it, the benefit is so much greater the cost. Because again, if we go back to the image of God, we're looking at these individuals as worthy of recognition and worthy of all of these of being cared for, and worthy of being cared for. And so all the benefits that we receive from having a bigger government, it helps everyone, and everyone has an equal access to all the benefits. If you go to a more localized option, then you have a very disparate communities that can be side by side. Yeah. If everything is very local, then wealthier communities will have really great government benefits, and poorer communities will have hardly any, just because there's less money. And so thinking about the money and the costs, it's kind of thinking about backwards, because if you take it too local and take it too small scale, then the money doesn't really get to go anywhere. When there's excess money, instead of sending it to those in need, it just stays where it's at, and just kind of makes the wealthier wealthier, and it makes the poorer poorer in all the worst ways. And so to the progressive perspective, all of this, a bigger government, a bigger centralized government, helps to distribute the resources of everyone more equally, so that you don't have such desperate kind of situations so close to a place of plethora of wealth, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And so does that pretty much sum it up for a pro big government?
Yeah, no. And I would say like you said, I really like actually how you said about cost. Cost is looking at it at a wrong angle, because like you said, the benefits outweigh the cost. This idea that everyone is seen in equal, every community, like you said, every community is not essentially discriminated against. I believe that that most liberal Democrats would see that people are being discriminated against. Communities are being discriminated against, and they don't have access to the resources they need. But not only that, like education, like financial, educational.
Yeah, in the book it mentions all kinds of like staples of communities, roads and fire and policing.
There's a lot of benefits. Our taxes aren't just, we're not taxing people because we're mean, but right. We actually, it's a benefit for everyone. Who wants good roads? Who's going to pay for it? Well, you got to raise taxes. You want quality things, infrastructure. Cities are growing. I'll take my home state, for instance. Austin area is the #1 highest percentage place where the people in all the United States are moving to. Austin area, New Braunfels. It's going to go to San Antonio. It's going to go out west to San Antonio and further west Texas.
Yeah. So I remember, I think like 30 years ago, Austin was not a big city at all.
No, even 15 years ago, I would go almost every summer as a kid. Actually, every summer. It's the state capital, but all you had was the state capital and University of Texas and the community colleges.
So it was like a college town, basically.
It was a college town. It really was. But then it became the coolest place on earth to live. And practically overnight, and Steve Colbert had a funny thing on this, but practically overnight, hundreds of thousands rushed, and they're still rushing because, Tesla's trying to move there too. Amazon, Tesla, Dell's already there. Dell was founded in Round Rock, which is now just a suburb of Austin. And so big industries are going there, bringing, hundreds and thousands and maybe even closer to millions of people to that area. And who's going to pay for that infrastructure? Because Austin has terrible infrastructure. And we need the state and the centralized government to raise. Sadly, I know I don't want to pay more taxes. Who in their right mind wants to pay more money? No one does.
Right.
But you have to understand, I love how you said it. The benefit outweighs the cost. Taxing people is not because you're a jerk. It's because you want other people to be benefited. You want schools, educational, environmental. We have so many environmental issues. We have another hurricane on the way to Texas and Louisiana. And when those things happen, who's going to step in? Yes, we have Salvation Army. Don't get me wrong. Red Cross. Is it Red Cross? Am I right with? Yeah, Red Cross.
Yeah, Red Cross.
Red Cross. Salvation Army. That's great, but I mean, they are only limited to do what they can do. And so who else is going to step in when thousands of people need help?
I think a good middle ground, regardless of which side we're on, is the church needs to do more.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ultimately.
And
Because, as the progressive side, you would say the church is failing to do a lot. That's why the government has to step in. And the right would say, the church needs to be doing all these things. And so both agree the church needs to be helping people.
yes.
But I think what some people get kind of caught up on is, some conservatives get caught up in a little bit of greed, and that they want everything to be, they want to be helping themselves a lot. They want to be helping just their little kind of community. They're the people in their church, but they need to be going out and helping others as well. And then I think some people on the progressive side might see their taxes and their voting as an excuse to help others less. Like maybe they see that as they're helping.
Yeah.
I don't know how prevalent that is, but I think that's kind of a problem that, we shouldn't just be, paying taxes. That's not our only duty as Christians, but the church needs to mobilize and go and do things as well.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that 100%, because even when I was still in the conservative worldview and had more of a conservative worldview, I would agree the church is failing.
Right.
I'm a pastor. I love the church. I would not be a pastor if I didn't love the church. But the Church of America in a lot of ways has failed. And I think that's a beautiful statement. I think, and both, as you said, once again, it's the image of God. Let's go back to the image of God thing. We both believe, most Christians on either side, and even non-Christians, believe that whether they call it the image of God or not, that everyone's created equal. Every man, woman, child is created equally, and so it's one of those things. Okay, the church is failing. So what do we do about it?
Right.
I think we're in the same. Sorry, I don't want to cover my face, but we see the issue. We see that the church has not done what the church is supposed to be doing, and so what we just see it in two different ways. We're like, oh, let's go this way with more centralized government, or let's go this way, more individualistic power, or localized state-wise, but really more localized. Our local churches, our local government here would say, in a lot of ways, big government and church as a whole, but really the centralized government needs to step in. So I agree 100%. I really love that statement. I think that, in my opinion, that sums up a lot of it.
Right. Okay. So as we go into the next segment, which goes into chapter 4, economics and poverty, this is kind of the debate between personal wealth versus shared resources. And in this chapter, it actually vaguely makes a mention of a third entity. And so I think this separation of church and state is an important thing. But then as we get into this chapter on economics, there's this third entity that's kind of plays a big role in our economy, and that is corporations. Because corporations have a vast amount of power, and they kind of group together, and they have their own influence in our culture, just like the church does, just like the state does, and it's seemingly separated from the state and separated from the church in its own way as well. So corporations are treated different than people. They're treated different legally in a lot of different ways. And so the discussion when it gets to economics becomes a little murky, and a little more murky, because we're no longer just discussing individuals and government, but we're also talking about corporations as well. And that's kind of a unique thing about Western culture, that we have such a corporate idea of our economy.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to present the liberal perspective here, and that definitely leans more towards the shared resources side. And so the idea that we all serve a role in providing the structures we have, we've all helped build what we have. And so we should all be sharing a responsibility for it, but we also should all be getting the benefits of the system that we've created, of the system that we've built. And what we're seeing is a lot of inequality. The wealthy aren't really paying their fair share. Corporations are ballooning a lot. It's making it harder for small businesses to function. And the part of that is because of corporations, because these huge corporations have so much power and so much legal leverage. They really get away with a lot where, a small coffee shop would not have the same kind of benefit. And so therefore there needs to be a leveling of the playing field. We shouldn't be necessarily providing regulation for all businesses across the board, but regulation for larger businesses that seem to get free passes when it comes to taxes, when it comes to still receiving the same benefit of the system without paying their fair share. And so since we all work together to build what we have, we should all be compensated for our work. The scripture says, do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain. And that's important because you see, again, the widely and unequal way people are paid, and the way pay structures go, the way wealth is congregated towards these larger corporate structures. And people who are part of that get to be a part of that system, while the rest are still stuck in our non-corporate world. And so this is all perpetuated by greed, where the greed seems to be the driving force behind all of this, where the wealthy are hoarding resources, and it's just creating this vast amount of inequality of wealth, inequality of income, inequality of access to government structures, even because they seem to get all of the benefits first.
Yeah.
Anytime there is any benefit, corporations get the benefit first. Anytime there's any sort of law passed, corporations get their say in before anyone else. And that just creates an unequal structure for our society. And so that's kind of what's going on with the progressive mind. Is that pretty accurate, Braden?
It's the paragraph right before the prophets and Psalms in that chapter. It says, further, wealth is sometimes gained by taking advantage of others. And so I would say more in the democratic, liberal, progressive, whatever word you want to use. And I would consider myself a moderate, but depending on how you view me and my our political discussion on issues. But I think that's a big thing that corporations do. When we monopolize, we take advantage of people. We lay off look, we saw it in COVID. We laid off so many people. A lot of businesses laid off a lot of people, and they realized, wait a second, the cashier at Walmart is really important because they have that connection with everyday customers. Mm-hmm. And so you just can't belittle the people that get paid $10 or maybe $12 an hour because they actually have, it's ironically sort of like the centralized government, local government argument, but in reverse. Mm-hmm. Because, a lot of conservatives will say, we need to get, no, everyone's entitled to get as much money as they want, including CEOs and administration. And so, liberals would usually say, hey, bump up the minimum wage for people because they work their butt off so you can make you can make your millions.
Right. So
maybe billions, depending on their
So then I guess a thing to add to this would be the government's role in addressing all this inequality. And so minimum wage is a big thing, yes. Different requirements for employers and stuff like that. And so you see that as the way that government should be stepping in and leveling the playing field kind of thing.
Yeah, totally. Because corporations won't do that to themselves. That would be self-harming their self-interest groups. They're essentially one big self-interest group, and that's maybe I just view it that way. And from liberal standpoint, my more democratic standpoint, but yeah, I think you hit it up on those things. But I just wanted to add that corporations have, like you said, are a third entity, and they have so much power in determining the life of people. And you could be working for an organization for 30 years and tomorrow they can kick you out and it doesn't matter anymore. There's not much, what's the word I'm looking for? The relationship isn't as it used to be. Back in the day, you could work until you're 60, 65, and they give you a golden watch and they, have a party for you. Nowadays, you can work for 30 years, tomorrow not have a job and have no benefits. Though you've worked for them for 30, you have helped them the last 30 years, and tomorrow you could be on the streets or trying to make ends meet. So.
Okay. So go ahead and go into the conservative side with this argument. Then what would conservatives say about this kind of stuff?
Hold on, let me go.
So this chapter of personal wealth and shared resources.
Economic. See, here's the thing, and this might not be fair, and I'm trying to be. I got my conservative hat on now, and so I'm trying to. what I was always taught, you know, and and Paul, I don't know if it's in this chapter, but they talk about, you know, the lazy person, the sluggard, you know, earns his wages. If you're lazy, if you don't work, you should not get money. You should not get benefits. Like you said, the conservative would say actually people don't work and they shouldn't get benefits. And I think that's one of the biggest issues, this and the next chapter, which we won't talk about today, but the whole issue of healthcare. Because, well, this person's not working. Why should they get healthcare? Why should they get the benefits, you know, essentially getting the money off my back so that they can live with the benefits that only working people should get? And so I think from a conservative side, first and foremost, is this idea that actually everyone is not working. Everyone is clearly not working and they don't want to work. And people, I mean, COVID might be an example, conservative head on still, you know, COVID might be an example. Like some people purposely got an unemployment when they could with the COVID, essentially the COVID bailout or whatever you want to call it. When the government said, and different states said, I was in California at the time, where you can, if you're working, go into unemployment and get unemployment checks. And that unemployment check, most of the time, was more than if you were working a 40-hour work week. It was more than those who worked. And so essentially, the government was giving, centralized government was giving those who do not work more benefits and more money, more resources than those who were working their butts off, working 40 to even higher, you know, working 3 jobs, Walmart, local bookstore, Amazon, I don't know, 2-3 examples that came to mind, you know. So really the conservative mindset is actually not everyone is working, and that's a huge problem, plain and simple. You know, you don't work, you don't eat. The Proverbs talk about wisdom and about how you attain wisdom from working, and how work, and then we'll go back to Genesis with this image of God stuff, work was from the beginning. Work was from the beginning. So work is a God-given activity. And so people should want to work because that is part of their image of God in them. And so it's once again, it's on the individual. It's on the individual to say, I'm going to make as much as like Wesley said, it's the John Wesley principle. Make as much money as you can so you can give as much money as you can. And so you can give more resources, your time, your money, maybe help someone pay their health care benefits. And so we should not be taxed. Our resources should not be stripped from us more and more progressively, exponentially over the years, so other people who are not working can get the same benefits as those who are working. And so it takes my individual right away when you say I can't make as much as I want, that I have to give more in taxes because I make more. You know, that's not fair. That's another thing. That's not fair. Because I make more doesn't mean I should get taxed more, you know? And that's another big issue that I've heard over my because I make more does not mean I should get punished more. Once again, like you said, the government should not punish good behavior.
We get into the other points in this discussion. We'll see larger priorities the conservatives have. Where this is still a very big priority, like the liberal progressive side, this is a big priority for them.
Yes.
Because the inequality is so obvious.
Yes.
And, the oppression is so obvious. A lot of things that, again, the problems we agree on, I would say. Yeah. The solutions we disagree on, but because this is such a big part of our economy and it's such a big issue for progressives, it's still very relevant for you guys to talk about it. But for conservatives, it seems to have just gone to the wayside. Yeah. And I think it's because of the other things that are coming up in our discussions. And that's something I kind of want to touch on, is that we're not addressing all the same problems when we're discussing these things. Like our politicians don't categorize all these things equally. And on either side, they're not even, like, the top 3 issues are not the top 3 issues on the other side.
No.
Not even close.
Oh, no, it is. But you're right. It's not, we're not going to list those off because we'll get there later down the road.
Right.
The point is, you're absolutely right. It's interesting, like you said, I think people, I mean, once again, I think we have the same scripture. I mean, we have the same scripture as Christians.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of people who aren't Christians on the conservative side. There's a lot of people who aren't Christians on the liberal side.
And I think we all see the same problems too.
Yeah. Oh, yes. But exactly. It's like you said, the solution and how we used what level of government, or in some ways, no government
Mm-hmm.
would actually be would find better solutions.
Right.
And so
And that's our disagreement.
And that's but once again, let's just say, like I said, image of God thing, you know,
We totally agree on.
that lived out, how we see that in practice.
Right.
And I think and this is funny because I think there's a lot more similarities in conservatism and liberal, not the extremes, don't get me wrong. I'm not talking about the extremes, but in conservatism ideology and liberalism ideology, but it's just, okay, how do we, what do we focus on? Our focal points are totally different.
Right.
And our solutions are totally different.
Right.
And those are the two main arguing points. And as we talked about at the beginning of the discussion, it's now just become ugly. It's just now become, instead of talking about solutions and where we differ in our focal points and how we solve issues, it's become character shaming.
Mm-hmm.
We desecrate one another so that we can look, ironically, more like Christ, and in some weird way,
Right.
or at least, and this is, maybe it's because we're all created equal, and this, we believe that. I think both parties do believe that, see that understanding of equality differently, but they would affirm, yes, we're all created equal. Yes, I agree with that. But, oh Lord, where was I going with this? But as I said, just the whole, like you said too, like the whole solution, the solutions are different. The focal points are different. And that's where we disagree. And that's where our representative peoples have clinged to those disagreements and at times gone.
But it's all, I mean, I would say it's almost like we're speaking different languages too. Because,
totally.
Because again, we see the same problems, but we prioritize the problems in very different ways. And so because our focal points are so distant from one another, as far as the party politics goes, we look like we're much more different than we are.
Yes.
Because I think, especially with Christians, when we get down to this root, we do see people as created in the image of God. We do see people as, needed to be loved by one another, need to be loving in community. The Christian response is to love and to serve and to be generous.
Yes.
But, it's how that works out in government and how much the church relates to that, how much the government relates to that. All that gets in the mix.
Of course.
And it seems like it's never, we're never on the same page.
No.
That kind of thing.
And it seems like we don't even, at least in a representational governments, whatever level, we don't want to be on the same page. That's another thing. It's like, okay, I hear you, but I don't even want to go there. It's like, I don't even want to agree with you because then I look like I'm wishy-washy.
Right.
The interesting thing is, if we just smashed, not extremes on both sides, but we smashed essentially modernism,
the moderate
yes,
center.
the via media on both sides of the conservative side and the liberal side, you would hit almost all the issues. Ironically, and I preach this, I bet you preach this as well, as we need each other as the body of Christ. And so we need each other we need not just each other as the body of Christ, but we need the issues that conservatives had. I believe that the liberal side needs to be concerned about. The issues that the liberal side is concerned about or focuses on, as we've been talking about, the conservative side needs to prioritize as well. So we need to come to making a more shared priority list, let's just say a to-do list, where, okay, number one could be a conservative idea. Number two could be a liberal idea. Number three could be a liberal idea. Number four could be conservative idea. It's sort of, what I'm saying? And I think we would be more I think we'd be more true to the Constitution. I think we'd be more true to the founding fathers and mothers and how they believed. Like we said, the intentional spaces that they established so that we can have these difficult disagreements and conversations. But as I said, nowadays, we just don't want to do the hard work of prioritizing of dropping, as Philippians chapter 2 says. I love Philippians chapter 2, and I loved it because it was 2 weeks ago's sermon. But Philippians chapter 2, Paul's talking about putting our self-interest down. Lay down your self-interest to grab up the self-interest of other people. And if we did that politically as Christians, I think our world would look a lot more like our founding in 1776. And I think our politics would be more healthy. Our Facebook, let's be honest, our Facebook conversations about politics would be healthy. Then we wouldn't feel like we just destroyed each other in the name of Jesus, ironically, you know. I don't know. I think that's an underlining. I think we hit the underlining point, and now we're sort of seeing how it practices.
Yeah, how it plays out, and that's again why I wanted to go through the issues, because these issues, you know, again, they can become buried for one side and really important for another.
Yeah.
So yeah. So as we, you know, it's kind of been a long afternoon, a lot longer than I thought it would be, but
let's do
3:47. So it's been a little over an hour. I'll just go ahead and wrap up with some area of humility as far as this economics thing goes. You actually mentioned it earlier. The one thing I had down was John Wesley's sermon, The Use of Money. Is 3 points: gain all you can, save all you can, give all you can. Yeah. And that's the need for Christians as individuals to actually try to maximize our earnings, but not for our own benefit, but maximize our earnings so that we can save all that we can, protecting us, our family, our future, and then ultimately give all that we can as well. And so if we're able to give more, that's great. And if you looked at John Wesley's life, he was a very wealthy person, but he was also a very generous person. And that didn't mean he didn't save for himself or didn't provide for himself, but he gave out a whole lot of what he earned and helped the poor and helped the needy and all of that. And I think that's something we, especially as first world Christians, where we are wealthier than 98% of the world, even at the poorest of us, you know, we should be seeking to be humble in what we have, you know, try to provide for ourselves well, but not get too extravagant, and then giving as much as we can to those who are in need. Because even though we are in a very wealthy society, there are people around us and people in other parts of the world that really need our resources. So that's kind of an area of humility that us as Christian, everyone as a Christian can follow that ethic. To gain, save, and give all that we can. Okay, so any closing thoughts? I think we kind of you already kind of closed up really well.
I already said my closing remark.
Yeah, so I mean, I would pretty much agree with all that our priorities, I think we're a lot closer, especially Christians especially, are a lot closer than we think we are, but our top priorities and even our second or third priorities are probably vastly different in the areas of politics. And so we're addressing things in a much different tone and demeanor than we should be, really. And so to understand one another's major viewpoints and why we think the way we do is really helpful. And so Brady, I want to thank you for doing this for me.
Thank you.
We'll discuss after I kind of end the recording, you know, what we're going to do for the next segment, but we'll cover 3 more topics next segment, and it will be out hopefully before the next debate. And so thank you all for tuning in and joining us, and may God bless you all.
Amen. Peace.